Imagine a young prince, barely 30 years old, suddenly thrust into the spotlight of global politics. He's charismatic, ambitious, and promises to revolutionize his country, a land known for its vast oil reserves and conservative traditions. But you don't need to actually imagine it. This is the real-life story of Mohammed bin Salman, the Crown Prince of Saudi Arabia. In just a few short years, MBS, as he's commonly known, has shaken up the Saudi royal family, launched an economic revolution, and promised to drag his country into the 21st century. But along the way, he's also been accused of silencing critics, imprisoning rivals, and even ordering the murder of a prominent journalist. So who is Mohammed bin Salman? How did he rise to power so quickly? And what's behind the growing list of accusations against him? It is 2015. Saudi Arabia's King Abdullah has just died, and his half-brother, Salman, ascends to the throne. Just then, the new king appoints his young son, Mohammed bin Salman, as defense minister. At just 29 years old, MBS became the youngest defense minister in the world. But MBS wasn't satisfied with just one title. He's hungry for more power and influence, and he's about to get it. Now, it wasn't quite that simple. In this family, there are 5 older brothers ahead of him. MBS was far down the pecking order, but he had an advantage. While his older brothers were busy with their own families, the young prince stayed close to his father, accompanying him everywhere and earning his trust. Sure, MBS wasn't always seen as a future leader. In fact, during the reign of King Abdullah, MBS had a reputation for being something of a troublemaker. Sultan, a Saudi exile now living in Australia, recalls, MBS was isolated and kicked out of the royal court for his misbehavior as a young prince. He was bullying, speaking rudely to people. But all that changed when King Salman took the throne. Within months, MBS was not only defense minister, but also in charge of the state oil company, Aramco, and the Council of Economic and Development Affairs. He was quickly becoming the most powerful man in Saudi Arabia, after his father. And he wasted no time in making his mark. Just 2 months after becoming defense minister, he launched a military intervention in Yemen. The goal was to push back against Houthi rebels, who MBS saw as proxies for Saudi Arabia's regional rival, Iran. The Yemen campaign was MBS's first major test on the international stage, and it revealed a key aspect of his character: his willingness to act boldly and decisively, even in the face of international criticism. But the war in Yemen would prove to be just the beginning of MBS's controversial reign. In 2017, King Salman made a shocking announcement. He was naming MBS as Crown Prince, leapfrogging him over more senior members of the royal family. Everybody was in shock. MBS was now next in line for the throne, and at just 31 years old, he was poised to rule Saudi Arabia for decades to come. With his new position secured, he set about implementing his vision for Saudi Arabia. And what a vision it was. In April 2016, MBS unveiled Vision 2030, an ambitious plan to diversify Saudi Arabia's economy away from oil and stimulate its private sector. The plan called for establishing a $2 trillion sovereign wealth fund, the largest in the world, and privatizing sectors of the economy like airports, education, and healthcare. MBS also promised sweeping social reforms. He talked about investing in cultural events and entertainment facilities, loosening restrictions on women, and opening up Saudi Arabia to the world. To many young Saudis, MBS's promises were electrifying. Here was a leader who seemed to understand their frustrations with the country's conservative traditions. He was promising them a new Saudi Arabia, one with movie theaters, concerts, and greater freedoms for women. Sure, MBS delivered on some of these promises. In 2018, Saudi women were finally allowed to drive, ending a decades-long ban that had become a symbol of the country's restrictive policies. MBS also relaxed rules on gender segregation, allowed movie theaters to open for the first time in decades, and even permitted some music concerts, all unthinkable just a few years earlier. To many observers, it seemed like Saudi Arabia was finally changing. MBS was hailed as a reformer, a modernizer who could bring Saudi Arabia into the 21st century. But that was just the surface. Underneath it, something else was happening. Even as MBS was promising greater freedoms, he was cracking down on dissent with an iron fist. In September 2017, just months after becoming crown prince, MBS launched a wave of arrests targeting clerics, intellectuals, and anyone perceived as a threat to his rule. The message was clear. MBS would not tolerate opposition to his vision for Saudi Arabia. But the real shock came in November 2017, when MBS ordered the arrest of hundreds of prominent businessmen, former officials, and even members of the royal family. They were held at the Ritz-Carlton Hotel in Riyadh, in what MBS claimed was an anti-corruption sweep. But this was seen as a power grab by him, a way to consolidate his control over the Saudi elite. Some of those detained reported being tortured. Most were only released after agreeing to hand over significant portions of their wealth to the Saudi state. For MBS, it was just the beginning. As he tightened his grip on power at home, he was also making waves on the international stage. In 2017, Saudi Arabia led a blockade against neighboring Qatar, accusing it of supporting terrorism and being too close to Iran. This blockade was another example of MBS's aggressive foreign policy, but it would ultimately backfire, pushing Qatar close to Iran and Turkey and damaging Saudi Arabia's reputation in the region. Meanwhile, MBS was cultivating a new image abroad. He embarked on a high-profile tour of the United States, meeting with tech titans like Mark Zuckerberg and Jeff Bezos. He pitched Saudi Arabia as a country open for business, ready to embrace the future. But even as MBS was being feted in Silicon Valley, troubling reports were emerging from Saudi Arabia. Women's rights activists, some of the very people who had campaigned for the right to drive, were being arrested and allegedly tortured. The contradiction was stark. MBS was presenting himself as a reformer abroad, while cracking down on dissent at home. But the worst was yet to come. On October 2, 2018, Jamal Khashoggi, a Saudi journalist and critic of MBS, walked into the Saudi consulate in Istanbul. He never walked out. The details that surfaced in the following days and weeks were horrifying. Khashoggi had been murdered and dismembered inside the consulate, allegedly on the orders of MBS himself. The image of the modern Saudi prince was starting to reveal his true colors. The CIA concluded that MBS had ordered the killing, though Saudi officials denied this. However, in the aftermath of the Khashoggi murder, MBS faced international condemnation. But at home, he continued to tighten his grip on power. In 2020, as the world grappled with the COVID-19 pandemic, MBS ordered another round of arrests, this time targeting senior members of the royal family. Among those detained were Prince Ahmed, King Salman's brother, and Mohammad bin Nayef, the former crown prince whom MBS had replaced. Not one, not even members of the royal family, was safe from MBS's reach. But even as controversy swirled around him, MBS continued to push forward with his vision for Saudi Arabia. He pressed ahead with ambitious projects like Neom, a planned $500 billion futuristic city in the desert. He also continued to court international investment, positioning Saudi Arabia as a key player in the global economy. And despite the backlash over the Khashoggi murder, Many international leaders and businesses continued to engage with MBS, drawn by Saudi Arabia's vast wealth and strategic importance. In September 2022, MBS's power was further cemented when he was appointed Prime Minister, a role traditionally held by the king. Why did they do it? Well, basically to formalize MBS's status as the de facto ruler of Saudi Arabia. But even as MBS accumulated more titles and power, the controversies surrounding his rule continued to mount. Human rights organizations accused Saudi Arabia of widespread abuses, including arbitrary detentions, unfair trials, and the use of the death penalty for non-violent crimes. The war in Yemen, which MBS had launched with such confidence in 2015, had turned into a humanitarian catastrophe. Thousands of civilians had been killed, and millions were on the brink of famine. And despite MBS's promises of reform, Saudi Arabia remained a deeply restrictive society. While women could now drive, they still faced significant legal and social barriers. The male guardianship system, which gave men significant control over women's lives, remained largely intact. Yet MBS continued to present himself as a reformer and a modernizer. He spoke of plans to diversify Saudi Arabia's economy, attract foreign investment, and create jobs for the country's young population. And, to some extent, he was succeeding. Despite the controversies, Saudi Arabia under MBS was changing. The country was more open to tourism, entertainment was more readily available, and there were more opportunities for women in the workplace. He continued to push forward with grand projects and bold initiatives. In 2023, he brokered a deal to restore diplomatic ties between Saudi Arabia and Iran, positioning himself as a peacemaker in the region. He also continued to court closer ties with China, seeing the Asian superpower as a potential counterweight to the United States. But the changes were happening on MBS's terms, and at a pace he controlled. Any hint of independent activism or criticism was swiftly crushed. In interviews, he brushed off criticism of his human rights record and insisted that he was acting in Saudi Arabia's best interests. But even as MBS plays on the global stage, will he be able to come out unscathed from the accusations he faces? Would he follow through on his promises of reform? Or would he continue to rule with an iron fist, brooking no dissent?